panel/session. It's going to be in a slightly different format. We have the pleasure of having 3 persons with us to actually investigate these issues. So first, Don Anderson is Senior Vice President and CIO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and he will be talking first. I'll let him give more details about his background. Then Ken Schneider, who's VP of Technology Strategy, and he was previously CTO of the Enterprise Security Group within Symantec. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Alina Oprea, who's coming to us from Northeastern, where she's an associate professor, newly minted associate professor in 2016. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ken to actually give us his take, Don, to give us his take on the whole thing.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Anybody here a banker? Anybody work for a bank? Did I hear a boo? So I work for the Federal Reserve, been there now for about 13 years, and I am a happy alum, so wonderful to be back. So a lot of people don't know about the Fed, and so I'll give you a minute overview of it. So we are like a traditional bank, like anybody else, a traditional organization. We have assets about our customers and information. But on the left, the things that are circled are critical because we're the central bank of the US. Pretty much every time you do anything with money, most of it obviously now electronically, it comes through us. It's north of about $20 trillion a day in transactions that we clear electronically. So when you think about, Mr. Robot was the example earlier, and I just started watching that a couple of weeks ago. They target this evil corporation with the hope of, everybody being free of all of their debt, and they start to see that some bad things happen and the society breaks down. That's obviously what we look at in terms of the Fed. So our mandate is low on inflation or stable on inflation and low unemployment, but we also operate the payments networks as well. So, from a cybersecurity perspective, it's our #1 risk that we look at. So the same thing as having the economy and financial stability and banking system be strong, cybersecurity is right up there too, because we understand that if something bad were to happen to us or bad were to happen to the banking system, it would have a huge impact other than people go to the ATM and they can't get their money for a few hours. So we do a lot of work with cybersecurity throughout the country, and our current state, a couple of things that we're focusing on. One, the banking industry is the pretty much predominant target in the US. So Department of Defense is #1, or defense industry, and then financial services is #2. And obviously the real carrot there is money. It's all about money. That's what cybersecurity is becoming about. Cybercrime is becoming about. Obviously nation states are involved, but what's more typical, and obviously the panel before set it up excellently, ransomware is now becoming a real business. It's becoming a career. You don't have to know anything about technology. You just have to be a criminal and find your way to get access to those things. The other thing, when it comes to financial services, people don't realize how interconnected all the banks are throughout the country. So rather than banks going out and developing their own networks, developing their own products, they pretty much share the standard network, which connects through the Fed. So a few years ago, kind of in the end of the financial crisis, and people were talking about too big to fail and the big banks, we started to look at that from a cyber perspective. Imagine if a large bank, pick whoever you want to pick, if they were to fail or go offline or be disrupted for a couple of days, what would end up happening from a financial perspective and liquidity? And then also, most of the banks throughout the country are very, very small banks, 1 branch, 2 branches, and their security guy is also their IT guy, who ends up probably as the branch teller on Saturdays. So how do those organizations, how are they going to protect themselves? And kind of going through an exercise, if a number of those small banks were to be impacted, knocked offline, if you're in northern Maine or something like that, and that's that one bank and you rely on it, and they go offline for some period of time or unavailable, or you lose trust in them, what's going to end up happening to the economy of that? And then obviously the Fed focuses on jobs. Cybersecurity is something, it's zero unemployment. New England alone last year, there were 15,000 jobs that went unfilled in cybersecurity. So obviously conferences like this are excellent for all of us to meet our potential pipeline. And obviously universities like UConn are doing an excellent job at helping to build that pipeline up as well over the next few years. So this is something, last year I did a lot of work internationally, and we looked at what's the impact of cybercrime. So if you look at the companies that have been hit in the past couple of years, like Target, or in Massachusetts, TJX had a number of them, the companies still exist, right? They take a bump, their stock price goes down a little bit. I joke with my wife all the time. She is a heavy shopper at TJX, which is TJ Maxx and Home Goods and a couple other companies. Over the course of like 2 years, our credit cards had to be replaced 5 times because of incidents that were occurring there, yet she kept going back every single time. So you look at these big cyber events, it really doesn't change people's behavior in terms of who they trust, because there's that safety net built in where, well, my credit card got stolen, no big deal, I'm not going to have to pay any of the charges and they'll send me a new card. So overall, the impact on the economy for cybercrime at the end of last year was about $400 billion. So to the US and China and the companies to the left of the line, that's not really a big deal, but imagine if you're one of those countries that are to the right of the line. And the first time we pulled this graphic together, I was in Slovakia talking to bankers in Eastern Europe, and they have a completely different situation that they're dealing with over there than we are here, because if they were to have a large breach, obviously it's not just about that one bank or the banking system, their entire country could be wiped off the face of the earth. Digital disruption. So, new products are popping up. We talk about how the Fortune 500 has completely changed in the past, what's it been, about 15 years. Companies like Blockbuster are gone. Everybody talks about Netflix. When you look at the banking system, most banks offer 50 or 60 products, and they try to be that, that one-stop shop where you can get everything. Well, now all these new fintech financial startups that are coming are just trying to get away at the margin. So for example, in Boston, we have this company, Circle, that does person-to-person payments. And they're going after, again, just a slice of the business that a traditional bank has. A traditional bank, though, has been around for a while. They have mature processes. They're in a regulated industry, meaning outsiders come and review their processes. Some of these new startups, obviously, they're not at that point yet. They're not regulated, and they're focused on growth. So you got to wonder, as you start to trust your money and your bank accounts to some of these companies, how do you make sure that you get the benefit of the service, but then also don't put yourself at risk as well? And a number of companies, Citi was a big one early last year. In Boston, we have State Street, that pretty much they've said over the next 5 to 10 years, because of this revolution occurring in fintech, millions of jobs will be eliminated. And when we talk about this, it's pretty much those middle-class jobs of the accountants and the finance people and the help desks and IT, all the people that are about kind of processing paperwork and following controls, because technology and some of the things that are happening in the fintech space are allowing those to be automated. So some of the areas of heightened risk that we have at the Fed, insider threat, employees that you hire, partners that you do business with, how do you trust them? It happens to us all the time, right? You see an employee, all of a sudden a large amount of data disappears. It's maybe a few minutes before they leave for the day or once they give their 2-week notice. Are they doing something malicious? Are they trying to send it off to a nation state? Is it a crime, or is it just an employee trying to make their life easier? So last week, there was an NSA employee that came out, again, that they had taken a lot of source code that the NSA uses to do their business. They had brought it home. Was the individual, again, just trying to do work at home, or were they trying to do something malicious? It's a big question. Ransomware was already talked about. Interconnectedness, again, people don't realize how our life depends on so many other things. So you think about it, if one business, one individual, one bank goes belly up or is disrupted for a little bit, but the more and more that we adopt technology, adopt the internet, it's going to become much more interconnected. So it's not just about the security of the organization I do business with. It's also about everybody else that they do business with as well. So best practices, when we do our talk, what do we, predominantly areas that we focus on that organizations should be focused on? Cybersecurity is about collaboration, not competition. So we started this a couple of years ago, a cyber threat sharing group that we bring together banks throughout New England. And for the first 6 months or so, these organizations really didn't want to talk and really didn't want to share. And the problem was they were all competing against each other. So they viewed it as, hey, if my bank's safe, but the bank down the street gets hacked, that's good for me because customers will bring their business here. In reality, what you end up seeing is one bank gets hacked, one business gets hacked, people start taking cash out of the bank and putting it in their mattress. So we've really worked with them throughout the country that banks are understanding financial services. It's more about sharing information, sharing vulnerabilities, sharing hacks. Tabletops is something that really suggest organizations to focus on coming up with what that absolute worst case scenario is and then practicing through and see how it would occur. So I can tell you, within the Fed, we've actually gone to our senior management and said, this one application is offline, what are you going to do? And, pushing them to make the discussion of who has the ability to actually unplug us from the internet and unplug the internet. Figuring out that governance of who is the responsible person, who is the accountable individual. So we do these tabletop exercises at the highest levels of the organization 2 or 3 times a year, and every time we end up identifying new things. Again, about who's in charge, assumptions of, well, if the internet goes away, we can just do things via paper. Well, nobody has paper anymore. So that's something that we encourage all organizations to do. So just my quick summary. So obviously the threat is increasing. There's more nation states that are active in this area than there was 2 or 3 years ago. The criminal aspect of it is getting to be huge, and they're really going after everybody now. The surface area is increasing. More organizations are making themselves accessible to the internet. So when you look at banking, it's still pretty much traditional banking, except for now you can do it from your mobile phone or you can do it from a web browser. So now you're allowing customers access almost into the vault electronically. Cost to defend and comply. Any organization is spending more money now on cybersecurity than they ever have. There's also regulations, rules that banks and businesses have to follow. That's increasing the amount of money that they must spend in that area as well. But I do believe, and we do see there's a lot more collaboration. I mean, this is an example where you've got many industries coming together that are saying, on our own we can't solve the issue, but hopefully together as a group we can. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Don. So I think that we might be better served by actually keeping all the questions in the block at the end. So I'm going to pass it directly to Ken to give his prepared notes.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to kind of talk, I think, a little bit higher level and take the lens back and open up the aperture and think about overall some of the biggest trends we're seeing in cybersecurity, some of the threats, and then what the solutions are starting to look like. So first off, I think you have to start with risk. There actually has been a little bit of conversation about risk today, but I mean, the reality is you can't protect everything in your organization with the same level of investments. You have to figure out what matters the most. And that sounds easy, but that's actually very challenging to do. And in financial services, there's actually a much more rigorous definition of risk in things like Basel II, which you're much more expert at than I am, but definitions of external and internal fraud. So the ability to actually calculate the risk of a particular system and then make sure you've got the right approach to securing it. But operational risk is just one element of overall enterprise risk. There's also things like market risk, how am I doing versus my competitors, kind of the strategic risk, am I investing in the right areas, building the right products. And I think the point on this slide is cyber risk is a growing part of all these risks. In the past, you didn't have to worry as much about the cyber threats against your organization, but today it'll have an impact across each of these risk areas. So a traditional approach to risk, of course, is first off, you have to be able to measure it and identify it. And then to manage it, you want to make sure you're putting the investments in the right prioritized way to reduce risk in each of those systems that matter. There was a little bit of conversation earlier, I think, about cybersecurity insurance. So that's kind of it's the fastest growing part of the US insurance industry today. And that's actually transferring your party risk to a third party. So you're saying, I'm going to take some of the risk of cyber attack and transfer that to my cyber insurer. And of course, the challenge is, how many folks in the room are familiar with cybersecurity insurance or have it as a, okay, wow, okay, great. So there's been, I think year to year, the cost of cybersecurity insurance is going up. The coverage is not necessarily expanding. And part of the challenge is the insurance industry hasn't really built the right models yet and the right actuarial tables to kind of measure that risk. Because it's hard for them to measure the risk inherent in a particular enterprise. So there's companies like Symantec that are starting to build out those models and trying to help measure security, both for our customers and then for insurers that want to offer them services. So we've actually hired actuaries now in the company. I mean, they're the best guys to party with, it turns out, in Symantec. No, I'm just kidding. the whole approach to kind of put in rigor in terms of this new expanding market comes down to measurement and being able to actually quantify risk, which is, is an ongoing challenge. But this is a fundamental, I think, aspect of security is you have to understand the place where you're going to put your investment. Secondly, the attack side continues to get more and more sophisticated. There's been a lot of conversation about this today. The attack motivations continue to expand. I think, Lena, you're going to talk a little bit about attack motivations, so I won't talk too much about it. But ultimately, the message is the attackers are getting more and more sophisticated and literally look like startups that are doing bad things instead of startups that are doing good things. And of course, a lot of the attacks don't come from the U.S. or even kind of places where there's the regulations against cyber attacks are well structured and well defined. A lot of these attacks are coming from places where they're much less so. So there's an asymmetry, of course, in the cyber attacks. And the level of sophistication doesn't just have to come from the attackers themselves. Of course, there's always been this ability to create very sophisticated toolkits and sell those to other folks so that they can leverage those sophisticated tools to generate attacks. And now we're seeing more and more attacks as a service. So denial of service attacks, I think there was some discussion earlier about an 800 gigabit attack that was going on over the last couple of weeks, which is probably twice as big as the previous attacks that we'd seen. And these are coming from folks that have control of botnets. Many of the devices in these botnets now seem to be IoT connected, cameras and other devices. And so the ability to provide attacks as a service is definitely part of the environment today. In fact, I don't know, folks may remember there were some big attacks against Estonia a number of years ago when there was some political activity going on with them in Russia. And they were under a massive denial of service attack at the time that got them to the point where they had to take down some of their, close down the connections from outside of the country. And they're very advanced in terms of online banking, online government. And the attack ran from 8 o'clock in the morning one day and stopped exactly at midnight, 2 days later. So basically the coins that the attackers had put into the, the attack meter ran out and the attack was over. It was all rented infrastructure. So this whole notion of sophisticated attack as a service is definitely part of the challenge of the environment today, and it's going to presumably get worse moving forward. The second thing I think is that what you have to protect is continuing to get more and more complicated. So as more and more applications are delivered from the cloud, as more infrastructure is leveraged within the cloud, the size of this attack surface gets bigger and bigger, and even having visibility into what you're trying to protect may be hard for many enterprises. This whole notion of shadow IT, businesses that are moving applications and services up into the cloud creates this much more distributed environment. And then the analog to that is it's a much more complex environment. And security is always most challenging in the gaps between some of your protection and the ability to make sure you've got a consistent approach. I mean, the complexity of this in a cloud virtualized world gets harder and harder. So in terms of kind of the attacks themselves, one of the real things we've seen over the last few years is a high growth in targeted attacks and a decline in broad-based attacks. And the old kind of big phishing attacks that we used to see that were very broad-based have been replaced by very targeted spear phishing attacks where you go after a particular individual in a company. A lot of social engineering goes into those attacks. Literally, I saw a phishing attack against a colleague a while back that had a picture of that person speaking at a conference going, like this. And the picture was in the email and they said, hey, I saw you at the conference, took a bunch of other pictures, click on this link to check out those additional pictures. I mean, simple human vanity says 100 out of 100 people are going to click that link. So social engineering is very good at getting you to kind of take that next step. And the ability of a targeted attack to go after particular individuals, of course, is enabled by all the social assets that are out there today. So it turns out the most attacked individual inside of a company for the last 3 years in a row now is the executive assistant to an executive. Because presumably if you can get to that person's desktop and their applications, you can then get to this high value information that the executive may have. Second kind of key finding, and a lot of this information comes from the threat report that Symantec publishes. Where should I actually be pointing this? Is it towards you? So it's kind of random. I don't know. There we go. A part of this panel, I think we were supposed to discuss vulnerabilities. So one thing we've clearly seen is a massive growth in zero-day vulnerabilities over the last 5 years. And the challenge, of course, is that by definition, a 0 day. The bad guys know about it before the good guys. And I think 2010 was where there was 14 0 days in total. 4 of those actually were embedded within Stuxnet. So it was the first time we, I think, had seen a particular attack or piece of malware leverage even more than 1 0 day. So 0 days are very valuable assets. Of course, you can sell those on the open internet. And the ability to kind of take 0 days and turn it and monetize those are a key point of attack. And the one thing that we're starting to see emerge now, I think, in the past, the monoculture that got attacked was Windows environments on Intel. And as that's now changed, we've got IoT, multiple different kinds of operating systems and operating environments. We've got lots and lots of different devices. There's actually this new monoculture that's starting to emerge that's unfortunately built on top of open source. So things like Heartbleed, where there was a vulnerability, a bad vulnerability, in an open source library that was widely leveraged across lots and lots of different kinds of applications and devices, was easily attackable by bad guys after that was discovered. And one of the biggest challenges around IoT, of course, is that how can you update and patch the software on those devices? Many devices don't even have the ability to do patch or do update. So now you get this long tail of vulnerabilities that are out there on the internet. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing 800 gigabit DDoS attacks coming off of IoT devices. Of course, many of which were attacked not because vulnerabilities in software, but because they had a default username password that was easy to get access to. And it wasn't even possible for the owners of those devices to change that username password. So just basic inherent security problems is causing kind of big vulnerabilities, not just in software, but in configuration, as you'd expect. And the last trend I'll highlight is this continued vulnerability in the web infrastructure that's out there. Something like 3/4 of websites have some vulnerability, and 1/4 of websites have a serious or critical vulnerability. So when we talk about kind of drop-by malware, or we talk about kind of attacks that use a website as the leading edge of it, that's because it's so easy for a bad guy to compromise a website and put a piece of malware up there. And in fact, when you think about how that's taken advantage of, crypto ransomware is a good example. So the last panel actually was a very good discussion of this, so I won't spend too much time. I think the point I'll make is that there's nothing new about crypto ransomware, and in fact, it's the logical evolution of what we've been seeing for a long time. And folks are probably familiar with things like fake AV, where there was a warning that came up on your desktop saying, hey, it looks like you're infected, I'll sell you some software to fix it. That was malicious software in the sense that you didn't have any problem, they were just trying to make money. That turned into extortionware, where they said, I've found pornographic pictures or something on your desktop, I'm going to report you to the state authorities unless you pay me some money to clean it up for you. That's now turned into crypto ransomware, where it says, I'm going to take all your files that you care a lot about and encrypt those, and you're going to have to pay me to get those back. So this has been kind of happening over a number of years, but it's really exploded, as the previous panel talked about, over the last couple of years. And there was a little bit of conversation about it, but I think one of the key drivers, of course, has been Bitcoin. It hasn't really been possible to derive anonymous payment in a scalable way in the past. And Bitcoin, I mean, some of the best FAQs to explain how to convert dollars to Bitcoin are in crypto ransomware. Very well thought out, exactly how to kind of get your 2 Bitcoin. And the ability to do anonymous payment is actually driving, driving this whole part of the challenges around crypto ransomware. So I wanted to highlight one kind of sophisticated attack we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years. And this was really going after energy companies in Europe, primarily. But the interesting thing was the set of attack techniques they used evolved over the course of 3 or 4 years. They really started out with spear phishing attacks, as we talked about, getting to a particular executive desktop and getting access to sensitive information or intellectual property. Pretty quickly evolved to using watering hole attacks. And watering hole attacks, of course, are where you try to infect a website, which we just talked about, to get your attackees to go to the website that you've compromised, and that's how you can drop malware down onto their desktops. This particular watering hole attack for these guys was against the mobile developers in these companies. So they went to Stack Overflow or some development website, injected some malware, and were able to infect the desktops of the companies they're attacking through that. The most pernicious thing that we've seen a lot of over the last couple of years is really kind of this expansion of Trojanization. And in this example was really bad because the Trojanized software came off of a software update site. So we talked about when you've got vulnerabilities, the key thing you've got to do is patch your systems, keep them up to date. Well, in this case, the bad guys took advantage of it. They compromised a software update site for a legitimate software application, wrapped some malware around that update, and came into the environment, using that exact technique. In fact, this was a huge problem about a year ago. Folks may remember at the Apple Store, mostly in China, where there was, Xcode is the development environment for many iOS applications. A lot of developers in China don't have easy access to Apple's website, so there's Xcodes that were set up on mirrors throughout China. Somebody took Xcode, put a malicious wrapper around it. A bunch of legitimate software developers downloaded that and created, took the next version of their legitimate apps, had malware wrapped around it, and went directly into the Apple Store, including apps like WhatsApp, so very, very popular apps. So this just shows you how pernicious something like Trojanization is, where customers and businesses are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, keep their software up to date, and now they're bringing malware directly down inside of their environment. So, a lot of this, the data that any security organization, whether it's an enterprise or a security vendor like Symantec has, comes from kind of these very large security intelligence databases that we've now been able to develop over the years. So this is where there's literally, hundreds of thousands of objects coming in a second to security intelligence platforms, helping understand what threats look like across malware on desktops and laptops, coming in through email. So advanced threats, there's literally petabytes of data generated a day inside of a large organization that helps you track all the security activity. And of course, the real question is, how do you distill that down to something that's actionable that you can do something about? So I think the big change that's happened in the security ecosystem over the last 5 years specifically is, in the past, all of this security telemetry data came in. People worked really hard to figure out the new rules and rule sets to push out to security products, and that's how security threats were stopped. I think today these are much more open platforms, that it's much easier to do information sharing, and you may want to take threat feeds from different kinds of platforms and combine those together and really understand what's happening within your environment. And if you're a particular organization, one thing that's very true is it's impossible to understand what's happening to you if you're just looking at your own telemetry data and your own environment. You have to have a much broader view. So if you're a bank, you need to understand what's happening to other banks to see if a threat hitting you is a targeted threat that's just going after the Fed, or if it's an attack that's hitting every financial service organization right now, or if it's a broad-based attack that's hitting across many industries. So the ability to leverage security intelligence platforms in a much more open way, I think, is kind of fundamentally what we're moving towards. And what that really kind of looks like then is where you've got a set of security applications developed on top of these open platforms. You've started to see APIs and web services that tie this stuff together. And ultimately, you talk to anyone who leads a security organization for a large enterprise, what they're really looking for is, a security architecture that scales, that gives you the ability to protect your sensitive data, that allows you to deal with, threats. I mean, there's been some conversation today about, well, kind of if you're just dealing with threats and you're not really thinking about how you protect yourself, you're not doing yourself, you're not providing the right level of service to your organization. Or if you're just trying to build the world's best security architecture, but you don't know if you've been breached, just as big of a problem. So you really have to balance your investment. And one of the key things that we're seeing moving forward, of course, is a much more granular security architecture, much more kind of containerization, putting the right containers around information, around applications. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting work that's going on to help create much more segmentation and a much more sophisticated model to protect kind of both data and applications. And this is all being built, I would argue, on open platforms. So I think that's it for me. Just kind of wanted to kind of finish with, the real challenge that we're addressing here today is training this next generation of security professionals, and simulation platforms, gamification, a lot of the stuff that is critically important is now becoming much more widely accessible. I mean, tabletop exercises, it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons for executives, right? Helping them train to kind of understand what a security incident looks like. But having your security professionals, your practitioners, understand what a real world attack looks like, what the latest breach looks like, and be able to understand that and actually play against that in a simulated environment is kind of where we're getting to today. So I think that's it for me. IoT security we discussed already, so I'll just kind of finish on that. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So I'll turn it over to Alina for the last 15-minute segment, and then we'll talk.
Okay, thank you so much. So the focus of my talk is a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about how we can actually defend against all these breaches. We heard about all these threats, all these attacks that are happening today, how the attacks evolve, and I'm going to discuss how can we actually use security analytics, machine learning techniques in order to proactively protect against breaches. And this is work that I did as a research scientist at the RSA laboratories before joining Northeastern University, which I did a couple of months ago. Okay, so as we heard, security breaches are on the rise. Even reputable organizations, including Target, New York Times, Sony, and more recently Yahoo, have become a victim of data breaches. And these are highly publicized by the media. Okay, so if we look at the current breach landscape, so the large majority of breaches qualify as crimeware. So these attackers are opportunistic, financially motivated, and they are interested in getting access to users' passwords and credit card information in order to perform financial fraud. But in recent years, we have seen the emergence of more advanced attacks, and these are cyber espionage and nation-state attacks. These attacks are usually targeting a particular victim organization, and they have very specific objectives, like getting access to confidential information or intellectual property. And these attacks tend to be more advanced in terms of technical sophistication, and they are also better funded. In some cases, they are sponsored by nation states. Just to give you an example of how one of these attacks look like, the RSA breach from 2011, this is an example of cyber espionage attack. So it proceeds into multiple stages. Initially, the attacker sent a spear phishing email to several users inside the organization. One of the users clicked on the email after retrieving it from the junk folder, apparently, and then his machine got infected. Then the victim machine started to communicate externally to a command and control site operated by the attacker, and this allowed the attacker access into the victim organization. After that stage, the attacker started to propagate laterally to other systems inside the network until he got to the system that stored the data he was interested in, and finally the data was exfiltrated to a site operated by the attacker. So that's the typical kill chain that we have also heard earlier in the morning in one of the presentations, and this is just an example, but I like to highlight some of the characteristics of these advanced attacks. They proceed in multiple stages. They tend to be persistent, so the attacker tries to maintain presence in the victim organization for months or sometimes years in order to continuously have access to confidential information. And the longest presence reported in the industry exceeded 2,200 days, which is almost 7 years. Now, these attacks also operate in a stealthy manner, meaning that they generate low volumes of traffic in order to evade detection. And the average detection time has been reported at 229 days, which is about 7 months. And lastly, in some cases, these attacks could lead to total compromise of a network. In the example of the Sony data breach from 2014, the attacker got access to the administrator credentials and effectively owned the entire network. Okay, so I'm really interested from a research perspective. What can we do in order to prevent these attacks, to proactively detect them in very early stages of the kill chain and prevent further damage? So let's take a step back and look how organizations protect themselves against these attacks. So many organizations today deploy a number of security controls on their perimeter in order to protect against breaches. And these include things like antivirus software, intrusion detection systems, firewalls, and web proxies that intercept and log all the HTTP communication at the border of the enterprise. So these controls generate a lot of data, and this data is stored mainly for compliance reasons, and this is used extensively for forensic investigation once an attack has been discovered by some other mechanism. But the question that I asked in my research is, can we, rather than sit back and use this data for forensic investigation, can we actually leverage this data in a proactive way to be able to detect breaches very early on? So can we actually build practical behavior models that enable us to leverage this data that is collected by most enterprises today? But it turns out that actually it's quite challenging to use this data for security analytics tasks, and so there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome before we can actually apply any type of machine learning algorithm on top of this data. And so just to mention mention some of these challenges. The first is that of big data. So in a large organization like EMC, where I had access to data from, we collected 2 terabytes of data, of log data on a daily basis, which is quite a large number. Let's see. Then the second challenge is that of a semantic gap, which is defined as the difference between the information that is recorded in the logs and what the analyst or what the algorithm is actually interested in getting access to. And then there are a number of challenges when we try to apply machine learning in cybersecurity. So it turns out that user behavior is quite variable over time, and so it's quite difficult to model user behavior. We have access to only limited number of malicious examples for training our models. In contrast with other domains where machine learning has been used successfully, like speech recognition or image translation, in cybersecurity we have only limited amount of labeled examples of malicious activity. So we don't have access to standardized data sets on which to test our algorithms. And so given that, building models that have high accuracy and small amount of false positives is really, really challenging. So all these challenges have been known before, and actually there was a paper in the academic community in 2010 highlighting all of these challenges and the fact that the limited success of machine learning in operational environments. Because of all these issues, machine learning has not been so successful in cybersecurity compared to other fields. And so I like to give you some insights that enable us to solve some of these challenges and to actually make machine learning operational in cybersecurity applications. So some of our key insights are the following. So regarding the big data challenge, our approach is to profile different legitimate activities on the network. So to create baselines of legitimate behavior, trying to understand what a user typically does, what external destination a user typically visits, what machines on the network he connects to, what are the user's typical working hours. And then focus only on the anomalies, on the unusual events, anomalies that look different from the historical behavior. And this enables us to perform a large amount of data reduction, so we don't have to process all the traffic, but we just focus on the anomalies. Then, in order to bridge the semantic gap, we correlate multiple sources of data. So, for example, we are interested in analyzing the network traffic activity, but we have to look at other sources of data like DHCP logs and VPN logs and Windows authentication in order to get additional information about the user that is making the network connection and his machine and IP address. Now, to address the machine learning challenges, we have several insights here. One of them is that we work very closely with security domain experts. So these are people from the incident response team, the EMC CERC, that interact a lot with advanced attackers. And so we use their expertise in order to extract a number of features that are indicative of malicious behavior. And many times the human experts are actually our only source of information about the operation of these advanced attacks, because we cannot find that in any textbook or in any published paper. And then we use a number of machine learning algorithms ranging from supervised learning to anomaly detection and semi-supervised learning. But the key insight here is that we look at the kill chain. There are different stages in the kill chain. And so we try to model each stage with a different model. Say we build a detector for command and control activity. We build a detector for malware delivery, or detector for lateral movement, and a detector for data exfiltration. And then we try to correlate, and actually each of these detectors might have a large amount of false positives, but when we correlate different stages of the kill chain, we are able to reduce the amount of false positives. Okay? And so based on these insights, we built an analytics platform at RSA that processes and analyzes multiple sources of data, including web proxies, firewalls, VPN, domain controller, and Windows authentication. And the first thing that we did was to build a normalization layer. So we normalized all the identifiers, all the timestamps to a common time zone, and we preprocessed the data. Then we built a number of behavior profiles to capture the legitimate activity across several dimensions. At the same time, we extracted a number of features in collaboration with domain experts. These are features that are highly correlated with different types of malicious activities. And then we applied a number of statistical models, including supervised learning, semi-supervised learning, and anomaly detection. And the output is a list of prioritized alerts, which we give as input to the human analyst, to the CERC for investigation. And based on their feedback, we continuously refine our models to take into account the feedback from the investigation of the human analyst. And so this platform has been used successfully in a number of different applications. And I'd like to highlight briefly just one of them. So here the particular, how much time? Okay. A particular application here was to detect the malicious communication initiated by internal hosts in the enterprise, right? So we are analyzing the HTTP traffic, and we're trying to detect suspicious connections that happen during the command and control phase of an attack. And we have used a technique from graph theory based on belief propagation, which I'm not going to discuss in a lot of detail. But for these results, we have used 2 months of data, in total 38 terabytes of data. We used the first month to train the models and the second month to actually test the models. And these are the results in the second month, where the graph shows the number of suspicious connections that our algorithm detected as a function of some parameter in the algorithm, which I don't have time to explain in detail. But over a month, we detected about 260 suspicious connections with our machine learning algorithm. And then we manually investigated these findings in collaboration with the incident response team. It turns out that the precision, a number of domains that were actually confirmed to be malicious is 76% of all of them. And the false positive rate is 10 to the minus 4. It's extremely low, right? And so what is interesting here is that all of these suspicious connections are things that have bypassed the security controls that were deployed by the enterprise. So we had a number of security controls on our network. We had antivirus software, firewalls, web proxies, and they implemented a number of security policies. But this is on top of what those already blocked. These are the things that we detected and were confirmed to be malicious. And so based on these techniques, we have generated automated reports for EMC CERC for more than a year. So the algorithms have been used operationally on the EMC network. And then the techniques are also implemented in RSA products in order to detect suspicious destinations. Okay. Now I don't have a lot of time, I guess, to... Oh, there are some references here on some of the... We published some of this work, not everything, but most of it is published. And I'm going to give a talk at the IEEE SecDef conference in Boston at the beginning of November on the design of the analytics platform. Regarding the waterhole attacks, what you just mentioned before, we have a paper coming up in December in ACSAC, where we actually do some analysis on, and we discuss some techniques for detecting these attacks, also based on machine learning and looking at how a website changes the behavior over time. Okay, so I'm going to skip the rest, I guess. So I'm now starting at Northeastern University. I'm part of the Network and Distributed Systems Security Lab. And we have a number of projects around security of network protocols, cloud security, security of connected cars, of course, security analytics, and security of software-defined infrastructures. And I guess I don't have time to describe this, but I want to conclude with a picture of a new building that is currently under construction. And there will be a new institute at Northeastern University on cybersecurity and privacy, which is going to be launched in the spring, in 2017. We have a number of positions for PhD students and postdocs, and we are also interested in collaborating both with academic colleagues and also with industry. So if you are interested in any of these topics, please get in touch with me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So let's first thank, in one shot, all 3 of the speakers on the panel. That was very nice of you. Thank you. So I'm gonna kick it off with a question that I think you can all contribute to. One thing that I noted in your remarks is that on one hand, you pointed out that there is not enough sharing of information between the various banks, for actually defending and coming up with techniques that are usable at large across organization. You also said, and that was from you, Ken, that insurance companies have a problem for coming up with proper actuarial tables for analyzing the kind of risk that pop up. But at the same time, you also reported that the number of incidents is growing significantly over the past couple of years. So it seems like there is a treasure trove of data out there about actual breaches that could be used. At the same time, I hear Alina talking about using machine learning and large amount of data sets, really describing big data of normal behaviors and fishing out for deviations, let's call them that, from the norm, and really recognizing that as potential risk and being quite successful, apparently, in isolating new complex patterns that are over extended period of time, I gather, for attack against systems. So how can we pull all of this together and really try to come up with techniques that allow us to collect large amount of data and make a positive use of it in techniques such as this? It seems that the technology is getting ready to go there. So what is the right way to go forward?
That's a big question. So I think, I agree with the points. Ultimately, all of these investments in big data to be able to gather, a tremendous amount of security event data into a single place within an enterprise or within a security organization is, been going on for quite a while. And now we're starting to see machine learning and especially deep learning techniques being applied on top. Because one of the challenges, of course, when you've got a tremendous amount of data that's changing very quickly, is it's been hard to train with traditional techniques because you need to have good examples of what's good and what's bad, and then machine learning, there's various technologies then kind of figure out what they think, what the verdict would be. With deep learning, we're able to just throw a lot more data at the deep learning engines, and they can do things like feature identification and understand a much broader spectrum of events and start to then chain together. Because part of the challenge too is reasoning. Like having a deep learning system saying that's good or bad is fine, but you have to understand, to a certain extent, why that is, because we've got human beings behind these systems. So I think what we're starting to see is the security big data platforms are coming into place. The deep learning and machine learning technologies are starting to mature. And then the ability to share information, there's two parts of that. One is within an enterprise, and the second part is across enterprises. So there's a lot of projects going on that are kind of public sector, private sector, as you're, I'm sure, familiar with. We're doing a lot of work, for example, with the DHS that's really pushing towards kind of helping to solve both parts of that problem, being able to share security information within a single organization, because you've got, like a large company may have 50 or 60 or 70 different security technologies that they deploy. So how do you get kind of information kind of shared across those? And the second part is how do you take much more automated action? So that's where we're starting to see a lot of effort to say it's not good enough just to very quickly figure out something is going on, develop behavioral baselines, see if there's anomalous behavior, but you need in almost real time to be able to put protection in place. So those are kind of some of the research areas that are starting to, I think, become real and become operational. And I think to your point, like it's easier to do this within a particular company or organization. Doing it across organizational boundaries is harder. So figuring out the right sharing models and kind of getting to the point where we can do that more successfully, I think we're moving in that direction, but that's still hard.
So how can you incentivize large organizations that have had breach to actually share these negative stories about themselves, about their infrastructure, their logs, so that you can put this learning technique to work with actual training data that contains real incident? How do you incentivize them? Like banks, for example.
One thing we do today is we anonymize all that data. So there's organizations that can gather a lot of data from across many different companies, anonymize it, and use that to do some of this analysis. And of course, there's lots of different feeds that come from various open source places that you're able to do many similar things with. To have companies actually expose a particular incident or breach and do all the forensic analysis of that and report on that is something that I think it's challenging for many organizations. I mean, they legally have to report, of course, for many breaches, and so some of the information comes out that way. But I don't know, that's probably a good one for you.
You got to kind of question the value too when, like RSA was after a couple of months, was very transparent in terms of what happened. And pretty much every organization when RSA happened, senior management board of directors said, can you assure me that won't happen here? And you really don't know, right? And then by the time it comes out, you can kind of draw differences. Ken's absolutely right. In the past, probably 5, 6, 7 years, because of the fact that all these vendors now are leveraging the cloud and sharing data electronically and anonymous, products have gotten much better. Meaning, Ken could get hit by something, and 15 minutes to half an hour later, I'm protected too, because we're all in the same, user base. I think what'll be interesting is a lot of the times companies now are making a decision of, I'm going to buy Symantec versus RSA because Symantec is 15 minutes and RSA is 30 minutes. What will be interesting, because those have become differentiating factors, right, proprietary to those companies. What'll be interesting to see is, where academia and industry can kind of come together and collaborate and say, at the end of the day, it's not about what product you pick, it's how can we get all that data in there and analyze it, and then provide that out to everybody, regardless of what vendor you aligned with.
Yes. One thing that I was thinking about as well, in relation to Scott's talk this morning, actually, he was talking about collecting large amount of data that's largely noisy. And then I hear in your presentation saying feature extraction. We have lots of data and we need to actually fish out the important bits and pieces. And of course, here we're not in an IoT world. If we're thinking about larger system, it's something that can still be done in a centralized fashion. But how can we actually do that in a way that is somewhat sector independent, so that you can recognize logs coming from industries in different sectors and still have generic techniques that do these feature extraction? Any idea?
From a security event perspective, I think one thing you've seen that has been pretty successful is a kind of a log aggregation collector model that's developed over many years. So the ability to kind of take information from very noisy sources, kind of sensor data, dedupe and kind of normalize that data, and then pull that into kind of the big data backend platforms. That's been going on for many years, and for SCIM and some of the cloud-based log management and archival systems that are in place. I think part of the concept of, we were discussing this morning about edge analytics and doing more work at the edge has always gone on to a certain extent, because you don't need, if there's a log line that's got a timestamp and an event and it's the same one 25,000 times in a row, I don't need to collect all 25,000 lines. So applying intelligence at the edge and then bringing as much of the kind of pieces to the next step in that you can leverage is, I think, always been an important part of the model. But ultimately, I think the opportunity is to apply intelligence at each of those layers, and then to kind of get to the point where you share information by centralizing a lot of it, but also have very fast action, be sure operating out at the edge.
Alina, it sounds like you want to chip in. I see it.
Yeah, we're talking about feature extraction. So yeah, I think my approach was mostly to focus on particular classes of threats or attacks, not so much on the sector, or say we are in a financial world or in a manufacturing business, but thinking about the type of attack, the behavior of the attacker, and how we can actually extract features that correlate with that behavior. But of course, for that, we need access to a lot of label data in order to test if our features are actually accurately representing the right data. The alternative is to have access to only the legitimate data. Then we have to apply an anomaly detection approach, so we can still test if our features correctly represent the legitimate data, how much can model a particular data distribution. And so I think there are techniques that we can use from machine learning to try to extract better features. In the end, a big challenge that we have is to evaluate, if these feature extraction methods and the machine learning algorithms are actually having good accuracy. Our approach was to manually investigate the top findings. So, to prioritize like the incidents that are most suspicious, but then to perform manual investigation, because we are looking for new attacks for which we don't have the ground truth information. We don't have a label. So the only way to confirm them is by manual investigation. And that is very time consuming, and you need people with the right expertise to do it right. Like even analysts, we find like some analysts are more junior and some are more senior, and they will give you different answers if they look at the same event, right? So how do we get that in the right way? I think that's a huge challenge.
Okay. I'd like to turn it over to the audience for some questions before we go on.
Mm-hmm.
It's number 10.
Thank you. So I want to run an idea by you. It may be a silly idea or maybe a light bulb moment for all of us. I think as we talk about breaches, as we talk about vulnerabilities, whether they're from open source or our own proprietary products and software that we develop and deploy within our enterprise footprint, we tend to react to an event has happened, let's collect the data, let's learn from each other, let's do information sharing and teach each other, and then kind of move on to the next big thing. And whoever that happens to, then we'll go back to the same table and repeat the same exercise. So I'm wondering, and I know a lot of companies are doing that for their own sake, but I'm wondering if this is an opportunity, maybe in CyberSEED, to make the recommendation to say, you know, as companies are developing these bug bounty programs where they're saying, all right, I know the hackers are out there, they want to embarrass me, or they want to do whatever they want to, you know, gain some sort of a reputation, money, or funding from me, but I want to have them come through the proper protocol so that they could help me find the vulnerabilities through this bug bounty program. Do we, as an industry and government and academia, have an opportunity to create a consortium of bug bountying? So whether that bug exists in Comcast infrastructure or in financial sectors or in some other sector, product, research, where we invite the hackers to work with us. In a way, it will be a cyber conflict resolution forum, if you will, where they could come in and instead of attacking and exploiting the vulnerability, to kind of turn it on its head and say, help us understand and work with us. What do you guys think about that idea? Because I think that could be a transformative practice for all of us.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good idea. I mean, the question is, how do you set it up? How do you organize it? You know, how do you make this? You have to make this data available. You know, the organization will have to contribute to a common repositories, and then you need to set up like a sort of red team, blue team type of competition. As an example, what we had earlier this year was the DARPA Grand Challenge competition, and that was really, really successful. And we are thinking about something like that in the context of the Massachusetts Open Cloud. So I'm working very closely with MOC, the Massachusetts Open Cloud in the state of Massachusetts, and we are building an infrastructure to protect the public cloud against attacks, and we are thinking, how can we test it? Because we have our own algorithm, we can test it, but the best way would be to set up a competition, right? And invite, in our case, students, at least start with students, to hack into the cloud, collect the data, analyze it, and then see if we can respond, and where are the gaps. And I think to generalize, take this idea and generalize it further, I think that would be a great way. But we need a lot of resources in academic world to make these things happen.
Okay. Maybe one last quick question, and then we'll wrap up to stay roughly on schedule.
So, question for Don. Regarding the interconnectivity, and in particular, FedWire, FedACH, and the Fed's role as a transaction clearinghouse, broadly speaking. With what we've seen in terms of some of the larger heists that go across these networks with the Bank of Bangladesh and so on, what ability and what responsibility does the Fed have to detect and quarantine a node that has been compromised on this network to ideally prevent the first transaction from going through, but if not that, to detect a series of suspicious transactions and quarantine a node to mitigate that damage?
So I can't, because of Bangladesh and the Fed being involved, I can't comment specifically about that incident. But I think what the exploits in the SWIFT network have really shown or drawn a light on, most of those targets have been probably the less sophisticated countries and banks that have been impacted. And what it's really shown is the fact that we're all interconnected. So I can tell you, from a Fed perspective, and obviously, with SWIFT, everybody has these standards. If you want to play ball with us, you got to be 48 inches tall. The PCI network that we all use for credit cards does the same thing. They have standards, but then they come through and they audit to verify, right? An independent party has to verify that you're following those rules. What it's really shown with these big, gigantic, high-value payment networks is we're probably going to have to start doing that as well, is this, you know, independent trust and verification. From a technical perspective, obviously we do have controls in place and we have tools in place that identify fraudulent transactions, identify, you know, susceptible behavior, but, you know, they're not 100% all the time.
Okay, with this, let's thank all three speakers one last time, and then we'll segue directly into the next session.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, so John is coming.